His name was Luther. He was my maternal great-grandfather. It was the year 1900 in the Tennessee hills, and he and my great-grandmother married young. They were honest, hard-working, God-fearing folk, and next to the love of the Lord, kin was everything. To support his growing family, Luther took a job in a sawmill. Hard labor, long hours, dirty work, boring work, dangerous work, work he did not want to do. But he needed to provide and felt lucky to have any job at all. Then one day, his luck ran out. And shortly after his wife delivered their fourth baby girl, he was killed in a sawmill accident. The baby died. Back then, there was no welfare support, and people relied on kin in both good times and bad, especially bad. His wife, Cate, my great-grandmother, whom my mother would later call Mama, married again to a man my mother described as remote. They didn't have much, and nutrition was poor. The children shared one bed and didn't have room to grow. None of the girls reached 5 feet, but they survived. The youngest of these, my great-aunt Paunchy, whose name was really Florence, would say, in the nicest of ways, "We just hillbilly folk," had a framed half-body picture of her father, Luther, on the wall. Often, when I visited her, she would take me to the brown sepia photograph and gaze at him fondly, pointing out his long, slender fingers, talking about how handsome and how loving he had been, and how much she always missed him. Although she was so young when he died, her memories were few. They were precious. And she kept that portrait with her until her own death at the age of 92. Her niece, my mother, had a very different experience of fathering. His name was Benjamin, and he was a good man who tried. But he was a spree drunk. He would be gone for days at a time, and when he returned home, he was a mess. Having a drinking problem meant he was unemployable, so they lived with his parents. Good Southern Baptists, the family pastor would come to the house and pray. Pray for sobriety, pray for control, pray for relief, pray for divine intervention. And Benjamin would earnestly pray with him. But back then, there was no real understanding of or treatment for addictions, and the behavior continued. Finally, when she was 11 years old, my mother couldn't take it anymore. She stormed out and walked down the street to Mama's house. It was the Depression era of the 1930s, and times were tough. And Mama's house was already full of relatives. But Mama took her in, and soon my grandmother followed. My mother never forgave her father, and from the moment she left, cut him out of her life. She would not speak to him, associate with him, talk about him, did not invite him to her wedding. I never met him, never saw a picture of him, and I thought my maternal grandfather was dead until one day as a teenager, I mentioned that I liked the name Benjamin. And my mother said in a far-away voice, that was her father's name. No, not dead, just dead to her. It was years before she told me the full story, and it's been part of her journey of understanding, empathy, and healing. His name was George, and he was my father. You've already heard something about his father, Clarence, in the Twiddling Thumbs. Dad taught me how to read. I was 6, and every night we'd read a page from Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat. It was so hard learning to read, every word like pulling teeth. And I would complain and try and throw tantrums, but Dad would not give in. He would have to get that one page done. In retrospect, he had the patience of Job. Finally, we finished the book. I remember the night we read the last page and me running into the kitchen, waving the book, cheering to my mother with the relief of a long-distance marathoner. I finished it! I finished it! And behind me, Dad's voice from the living room, and now come back and we'll do it all over again. I hung my head and staggered back to the living room for another round of hell. But slowly, it came easier. When we finished, the next book was The Cat in the Hat Comes Back. And after that, well, I don't remember the one after that, although I can tell you it was not Green Eggs and Ham. Dad objected to the title. But soon I was reading on my own, and what a joy. Is there anything like the gift of reading? I grew up in a time when the phrase, "wait till your father comes home," was a common fear tactic employed by mothers. The paterfamilias, the head of the family, was the authority figure, and corporal punishment still common. Thankfully, this fear tactic was short-lived in my house, because my father protested against the role of coming home to paddle his children. He preferred talking, logic, and the Socratic approach. Dad was an engineer and a patent attorney. He loved science, technology, and aviation. He was a pilot in World War II, although he would never talk about the war except to call it hurry and wait. It was years before I got an idea of his mind. One day, he, my mother, and I went to lunch, and on the way home, stopped at a clothing store. As my mother and I rummaged through the racks, I looked over at Dad and saw him standing to the side, staring into space. I asked him what he was thinking, and he replied, "Math." Math? I like to calculate numbers to pass the time. Oh. Last month, my father turned, or if he were alive, would turn 102. I've never really been comfortable with the distinction between was or is. My father was born 102 years ago, which means he's 102 years old. Death does not change this truth. The passage of time is only one form of continuance. In my efforts to commemorate these fathers, it seems much of what I've shared is about the people who remember them. Is it possible our memories of another person are ever pure, or are they mainly tempered versions of ourselves? If others live on through us, it must be inevitable that as memories are processed through our own lens, that for better or for worse, it becomes a marriage of the souls. In life, death transforms itself into life. We take them with us in every step, the good and the bad. This is how we are. In holding space for Father's Day, I've attempted to share something of the men in my lineage and what they meant to their children. Our relationships or non-relationships with fathers are some of the most personal and complex relationships we will ever have in our lives. Each relationship is unique and as individual as the people themselves. Holding space is a conscious act of being present with compassion and with non-judgmental awareness, witnessing and deep listening in a safe, supportive environment. When we hold space for another, it is a great gift. When we hold space for ourselves, this gift is a journey into self-awareness and acceptance. Whatever Father's Day means, whether a pleasure to speak of or a painful subject, it is important to hold space for it. But holding this space includes being non-judgmental, and that is difficult. The space my Aunt Ponchi held for her father, Luther, was very different from the space my mother holds, if any, for her father, Benjamin, and different again for the space I hold for my grandfather, Clarence, and for my dad, George. The space my nephew holds for his father, my brother, will be different still. A father who cooks, cleans, does laundry, does the family grocery shopping, helps with homework, plays in a band, and is the primary caregiver for our 98-year-old mother. Roles are changing, and this increasingly common, modern version of caregiving is one in which fathering and mothering styles blend into parenting. All of these men, in their own ways, try and tried to be what society expected of them. Try and tried to be what their family needed of them. And in success or in tragedy, loved and tried to be good fathers. I'd like to take a couple of minutes now for us to hold space for our own thoughts. I'll ring the larger singing bell. In the words of Ana Marcia Varela, the essence of life is to communicate love. And then most surely, The words of my dear Great-Aunt Paunchy ring true. What we are really put here for is to look after each other.